I mean, if you're into, if you're into that kind of thing. Hi. This is really cool.
Yes. Oh, well, there you go. So before we get started, this isn't part of the official part of the evening, but I'm Bob. I'm the pastor here at the church. We are just delighted to have you guys and to have Frankie. I've known Frankie almost since I moved to Oregon. It's got to be like 8, 10 years. Yeah. Um, and love her and the work that she does and her passion for the community. So
Awesome.
we're delighted. Oscar, yeah, just met him tonight, but he seems great. Couple of bits of housekeeping. If you need a restroom, straight across the lobby into the fellowship hall, take a right, you'll see an opening. If you really need to, I mean, use whatever restroom you want, but men are to the left, women are to the right. And if you're parched, there's some water and some snacks, chocolates, cookies, crackers on the cart in the back here. That's it from me.
What a great host he is. Thank you so much, Bob. Bob and I, and again, we're not officially started yet. We will in a minute. But Bob and I, and along with some other ministers in town, we did the first time that the Trump administration was separating families. We put together a rally in front of City Hall, remember?
We had a couple hundred t-shirts printed. I still
Yes, I wear them.
Yeah, you do.
I wear mine.
Stop separating families.
Yeah, and I put it together on a Sunday morning, and I text Bob, and I thought, well, he's in church, but he'll read it and get back to me. No, right away. I said, what are you doing? He said, well, I saw. And then we didn't have a permit, which you really don't need on public grounds. But he said, oh, well, maybe they'll arrest us. And we were ready. Yeah, oh yeah. That's right. That's right. That was 6 years ago. Yeah, before COVID. I think we're about ready to get started. Oscar says just a minute. I'm not in a hurry. This is very cool that you all came out on a Monday night to hear about this very hidden history. And these days, I'm afraid all history is going to be hidden. And so I did a little research at the Lincoln County Historical Society, and they didn't have anything. They had one little book on Mexicans. And so, can you not hear me? Okay. I just need to move this a little bit. And what was I talking about? Now I can't remember. I lost my train of thought. Oh, the hidden history. Yeah, in these days, all history is now being hidden. And so they asked for my materials for the Historical Society because no one has ever done any research on Mexicans in Oregon. Well, lots of people have done that, but nobody's done that in Lincoln County and focused on Lincoln County. And so I'm grateful that they would like they'd like my materials to put in their library. So that was very cool. I think we're about ready. It looks like Oscar's going to. Oscar, since you're not mic'd, why don't I just go ahead and introduce myself? I can do that. Nitz, you are just fine. Let me just say that Oscar Juarez put this series together, and it's a series of 3 different cultural groups and what their history is, as well as, but focused on Oregon and as much on Lincoln County as possible. That's hard to do because there just isn't much. But the first one was on African American history in Oregon and in the county, and she did an amazing job, Valerie White. And this is the second of my presentations, and then next week there'll be 2 presentations. So each one has been doubled, repeated. Will be Peter Hatch from the Siletz tribe, and he'll be giving a talk about the history. I'm going to move around, Oscar, so good luck. They gave me a mic, a wireless mic. I can move. I'll try real hard to not move too much. I'm getting a little feedback.
I think it's probably because
It's that mic, isn't it? That's what I thought too.
Oh, you muted. Okay.
But I had her turned way up.
Thank you all for being here. I'm so excited to see so many faces that I know and so many of you that I don't know to come. Thank you. Oscar was really dedicated to wanting the programs to be presented not just in Newport and Lincoln City. And so on Saturday, I gave this program in Walport at the little library there. That was really cool. And then here, where else would you do this but at Pastor Bob's church? So are you wanting to say something before?
Yeah, well, just real quick.
Okay.
And since Frankie has the mic here, and
We'll stand close. We're buds.
well, thank you everybody for joining us today. This presentation, and it's just like we said, it is on a 3-part series. We actually had our first speaker that already was Valerie White, and now we have our second presenter, which is Dr. Frankie Trujillo Dalby. And I know that she doesn't like me to use her title, but I keep telling her, and she has earned it. And especially being Latinos, that we should be proud of all of our titles, and which we have earned.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, the other thing it is that this presentation is through a grant from the U.S. Endowment, and also that from Oregon Humanities, and also that it's been hosted by us, by Oregon Coast Community College, and of course that through the Yachats Community Presbyterian Church, which has been very grateful that are hosting us. All of you should have a ticket, and if you don't have a ticket, please let me know, because we're going to raffle off books towards the end, and these are Mexicanos in Oregon. And these books are absolutely free, and you see, and this is just a small gesture of appreciation and of you folks that are coming out. All right. So if anybody has not signed in or does not have a ticket, please let me know and just raise your hand, and I'll go back and I'll.
I have to say, Oscar. I met Oscar at OCCC. He's the director of the Early Childhood Education program there, and we've been working together ever since. We have a podcast together called Hanging with the Oregon Homies, and you can find it on Spotify, also through kyq.org. So let's get started. Let me tell you a little bit about myself, even though some of you know me. I grew up in West Los Angeles. We traveled to Toledo, Oregon every year to visit my grandparents and my cousins and my aunts and uncles. And then when I was old enough to be on my own, I wanted to come back to Oregon because I just loved it here so much. I loved the green trees and it was very different than growing up in West LA. And so I came back, and I've been here off and on for the last 50 years, probably more, but 50 sounds enough. Oscar mentioned about having a PhD. I'm the first in my family to go to college, and I just loved being a student so much. I just kept going. At that time, 20 years, my husband reminded me, it's been 20 years now, there were only well, right today, the number of Latinas with PhDs is 1%. So I'm guessing 20 years ago it was much less. I don't know if anybody even had stats about it then. I talk about myself as a Chicana, a Latina, a Mexican American, sometimes indigenous. My parents were born in the U.S., although my maternal grandparents were born in Mexico, making me second generation on my mama's side. My father's family lived in Placitas, New Mexico for centuries. In fact, they've traced our lineage back to a Zuni woman in 1621. And so, but that's a whole nother presentation. We're not going to talk about New Mexico today. We're going to talk about Oregon. You'll hear me use a variety of labels as we talk. Mexicans, Mexican Americans, Latinos, Hispanics, Chicanos, illegal aliens, depending on the time frame that I'm drawing from. You'll hear the language shift over time. Don't ask me what we like to be called, because that's really person dependent. But Latino works for me. I'll be talking a lot about my personal history here in Lincoln County as it fits the timeline as we go along. Bear with me. I hope that's not too much information for you, because as I was doing this research, I realized how much of it was my family's story in Lincoln County. And since nothing's written down about Lincoln County anywhere, I figure I'm part of the hidden history. So you'll get to probably know way more about me than you ever wanted to at this point. My stories aren't published in newspapers. I've looked, I've gone to the Historical Society, I've checked around. So this truly is some hidden history. And as I was saying before we got started, the Lincoln County Historical Society has asked for my materials so that they'll have something in their research library about Mexicans in Newport as well as in Oregon. So you can ask me questions as we go along. I'm very comfortable doing this. I've been a civil rights investigator with the state of Oregon for a number of years. I was a professor at Portland State in the communication department, and my doctorate is in community development. And so when I graduated at my dissertation defense meeting, my advisor, she said, "So Frankie, what are you going to do now with, what's your plans?" And I said, "Oh, I'm going to move to the coast, do some music, fiber art stuff." She said, "Oh no, what are you going to do academically?" And of course, I said, "Oh, I'm going to write a book," and but everybody already knew I was really just going to come to the coast and play music. So and we have. So let's see if I can make this work. There we go. So I'm talking about the hidden history of Mexicans in Oregon and in Lincoln County. Always we have to remember that we're on indigenous land. I'm going to talk about this land being Spain, this land being Mexico, but we are always on indigenous land. And I know that you folks here in Yachats are really aware of that. And I know that you've done a lot of, I know there's a group here that has talked a lot about that. So when I refer to it being Mexican land, realize it's always indigenous land, even today. So Mexicans, believe it or not, have been in Oregon since the 1520s. We were sailors on the Spanish ships. And the Spanish ships were going up and down the Pacific coast, kind of trying to claim territory in those days. And this land, except for what I just said about it being indigenous land, this land was Mexican land. But I'm going to show you a map in a minute. So in the 1700s, Spain claimed ownership of the Pacific Northwest, including lands in Oregon. Well, but then the Spaniards left, and I'm not going to go into all that history. It was tempting, but I'm not. Then the Spaniards left, and then Mexico claimed ownership, in quotes. In the 1819 was the Transcontinental Treaty, which then the U.S., and we say purchased because actually the U.S. at that point had invaded the Oregon Territory. But they bought it from Spain and Mexico and named it Oregon Country. In the 1840s, thousands of Mexicans immigrated from the Midwest to the Mid-Willamette Valley, and they really made the valley an agricultural site. It really was just, they were growing a little bit, but with all that labor, they were able to really start the agricultural industry. And we're going to talk about the Chinese Exclusion Act a little bit in a minute, but it created more of a need for Mexican laborers. So, as you can tell, you can see from this old map, and this has been going around on Facebook for a long time now, which I think is kind of cool, but you can see how much of the U.S. was Mexican territory. And so many of us were indigenous, are indigenous, because that's what we, that's where we were. So these Spanish maritime expeditions had some Mexican sailors on board, as I said. They explored, mapped, and laid claim to much of the Pacific Northwest, including Oregon. They also, unfortunately, brought indigenous folks smallpox. And as you know, that was devastating to the indigenous folks here. In the 1700s, Spanish ships actually came ashore in Oregon, 225 miles south of Yaquina Bay. So they were actually on the shore, and they named a lot of the places around here, right? Hecata Head, Cape Perpetua, Umatilla, Cape Blanco. All of those are Spanish names. I don't know where Yachats came from. Maybe you can all tell me. I don't think... Hi, Joanne. I didn't see you. She is an expert. Is it an indigenous name, Joanne?
Well, the original people here that were here for at least 8,000 years,
Yeah.
archaeological sites out investigations have claimed, have verified that they were southern villages of LC people, or Yachats, as they call themselves, and they were called the Yachat villages in the LC language.
Mm-hmm.
And then when a lot of them just died out from smallpox.
Right.
There were any survivors, but by 1820 there was no people here.
Oh.
And then in 1860 the prison camp was developed, and fortunately March Cruz or Uncross, some of the fighting Hawaiians. Later the LC were forced down when the reservation was divided.
Mm-hmm.
And the prison camp agents, they were large turnover, and I read their annual reports. They couldn't pronounce the LC language. They couldn't pronounce any of their language. But the Cruz Honest had a different dialect as well as a different language, and they called the people here Yachats.
Ah. And now you call yourselves Yahatians, I've found over the years.
It doesn't mean
Uh-huh.
means the birds can go on the road, or to the road. So these villages were southern villages, and they would take the beach to come to
Right.
visit these villages, so as far as you can go on the road.
Thank you. Thank you. Of course, if I'd seen you, I would have asked you. So that's like the ancient history of the very first Mexicans that were here. This is just, I thought this was kind of interesting. Yeah.
You mentioned the migration of thousands of Mexicans in the 1840s.
Right.
Was that related to the Oregon Trail or the collar in the Midwest? Or
I think that they came probably because of the gold. And also they could get work. Not just on ships, but you're a few slides ahead of me. But it is interesting to note that by 1840, Mexican silver pesos made up most of Oregon's currency until Oregon minted a beaver coin. That's truly the name of it. I think I don't know if you can see the beaver on it or not. I just thought that was kind of interesting. I'm not a historian, by the way. I don't think I've ever taken a history class, but in the last 8 years, I've been doing a lot of reading and a lot of studying. And but so if you see it, if you see a date that's not quite right, bear with me. Like I said, I'm not a historian. So that brings us up to the Mexican-American War. And after the Mexican-American War, there was a strong anti-Mexican feeling in Oregon. And Mexicans weren't allowed to acquire land in Oregon. Neither were, I think, blacks and other people. The first Mexican listed on the census was a 3-year-old boy in 1850. In 1860, 20 Mexicans were on the census. So you begin to see at least a record of how many of us were here. And then in 1861, we worked as miners, muleteers, and vaqueros. So Mexicans have been mule packing throughout the Southwest, throughout Mexico, probably for centuries. They knew how to do it, and they had the mules to do it. And so the U.S. government hired them to support the U.S. troops who were fighting the Rogue River War between the U.S. and indigenous people. I'm sorry to say. They also, they immigrated and worked as, like I said before, followed up the coast for gold mining. So they've actually been here a really long time, longer, than the 1800s. I have to mention that after the Mexican-American War, some of you probably are familiar with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And that treaty was supposed to meant that if you were on this side of the border in the U.S., you got to keep your citizenship, or you became a citizen of the U.S. automatically, rather. If you leave and go to Mexico, that meant you lost any rights to U.S. citizenship at that point. They were also, and this happened to my folks in New Mexico, we were also supposed to be able to keep our land grants that we got through the Spanish government, and we weren't. That was also taken away. Not an uncommon story. So one of the biggest events that took place was in this history was the impact of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. I'm sorry, I tell my students not to put so many words on a screen, but I always violate it myself. The Chinese Exclusion Act expelled all the workers, farm workers, railroad workers. Remember, the railroad is just really getting done. And so it created this gap of workers, both on the railroad and in the fields. And so by 1910, Oregon ranked 7th among states with Mexican-born residents. I think that's significant. The Immigration Act of 1917 curtailed European immigrants. But because they needed workers on the railroad and in the fields, Mexicans were exempted. Interesting to note in 1917 that the Border Patrol was created that far back.
I want to go back to two very quick comments.
Gerald.
Oh,
Sorry, somebody else.
No, you.
I want to go back to two very quick
comments. One is, I believe, not to contest this, but the Cape Perpetua was named after Saint Perpetua by Captain Cook, because Saint Perpetua Day was a day in England when everybody drank like they do now in St. Patrick's Day in Ireland.
Well, now,
So,
I would not be surprised if a white guy got credit.
The other one, a
for
little
that.
more substantive. My great-grandfather was the only Irish Catholic on the committee that created the state of Oregon.
Wow.
And Irish Catholics were terribly racist against blacks and Chinese. I think he's responsible. He was in charge of human rights on that committee.
Wow.
That's why the state, when it came in, forbade blacks and Chinese from holding any land.
Right.
I think he was responsible for that. God bless him. But anyway, that's I think he did that. Yeah.
Thank you for that piece of history. Yes.
What was the reason for banning the Europeans? Was it because of end of World War I?
I didn't go that deep in that history. From my readings, every time we excluded anybody, it was because the local people didn't want them here and complained. And you'll see that over and over and over again. And so, just like the Chinese folks, and in fact, right now, Florida has a new Chinese Exclusion Act not allowing anyone who's Chinese to buy land there. So, the one thing that you'll notice throughout my presentation is that we're going to repeat history over and over and over again. So here we are. No farm laborers again, so they had to exempt that act and make sure that we could have workers here in the valley. And Oregon farmers were really, they liked their workers. They had to have workers. And so they recruited a number of them. Foreign born in 1920, the number was 569, and they worked in all facets of both field work and on the radio and on the railroad. This is my family, the Trujillos. That's obviously my mom and my dad. Sorry, this is the only picture I have of all of us. That's, sort of, and this is 40 years old. But, so my sisters are up there behind me. I've got my little wedding thing on. But we're going to be talking about my mother and father a little bit today. So in 1920, my mom was born in a boxcar in Tangent. Here are my grandparents, my grandfather, Jose, and me with my grandma, Maria. They lived in Toledo. Well, I'll tell you the story. As I said, they were both born in Mexico. As the story goes, my grandfather and a friend came up from Mexico, leaving my grandmother in Mexico while they looked for work. And they found work in Corvallis on the railroad. And they joined other troqueros. I never knew there was such a thing as a troquero or a movement where Mexicans were actually recruited to work on the railroad. Because remember, the Chinese had been expelled. Europeans had been not asked to be here. And so, much to my surprise, the reason I knew he was a troquero is because one of the ways that they recruited Mexicans to work on the railroad was by giving them a boxcar to live in. So I always just thought that was some weird story, and then I find out this was common practice. My mom recalls there was no running water or electricity, cooked on a kerosene stove. I doubt there was a bathroom or anything. So it wasn't an easy life. At some point, though, they ended up in Toledo. And I'm not quite sure. They started, I think, in Chitwood, or they started in Tangent, went to Chitwood, and then ended up in Toledo. Because it was a lot of work. This was the Guy Roberts mill. I don't know if some of you remember if you were around in Toledo in those days, but all along the whole waterfront was dotted with the wigwams. Can you see it with the smoke coming up there? Isn't that what they called them? I think wigwam burners, I think, which kind of sounds pretty awful, but they were shaped like a teepee, I guess, is why they called them that. So he got a job there as a night watchman, in this mill, actually. And my grandma cooked at the Sunnyside restaurant, and my aunt's waitress there. It's now the Timbers. I told you this would be local. And my uncles, I had a lot of uncles. They worked in the mill. One was a millwright. One of them had his own logging business. And some of them are still there. There's still a number of chaverias left in Toledo. And I have one aunt left of that generation of my mom's, and she lives up in the mountains near Toledo. This is my mom. I'm sorry the picture glows, but you know, when you're looking at pictures from the 40s, you can't choose just how well they come out. I wanted to talk about Mom's graduation a minute because she started school in Chitwood not knowing any English, and her brothers and sisters as well. So she said they put them in a corner and gave them some toys and books and just kind of, I'm sure the teachers didn't know Spanish. They were one of the very first families in Toledo that was Mexican, and maybe even Lincoln County. So they were just put there until they could learn enough English to participate. They didn't have the benefit of an ESL class or any of the things that we do today. They struggled academically because I'm sure they lost years of schooling as they were learning English. They were made fun of by their schoolmates. By high school, though, they were fully bilingual. This is relevant because of because of a story I'm going to tell you in a minute. Oh, I'm sorry, I was supposed to point it up there. So the railroads changed everything. That's one spot. If you're in Toledo, that's the engine that's been there since I can remember. They used to let us play on it, but then I guess the liability was too great, and they built a thing around it. Now you can't get on it, but we used to play on it when we were kids. So two things happened. The railroad is done. It's completed. And they also created refrigerator cars. So that increased the number of produce and food that they could then ship around the U.S., which then meant they were increasing production, which meant they needed more workers. But then we have the 1924 Johnson Immigration Act, which gave rise to the wetback industry. That's their words, not mine. Really derogatory to call it that. But because they stemmed even more European entry into the U.S. and this is a little bit of a recap, created the Border Patrol, it is the first time that the U.S. used physical force to control immigrants, was in 24. However, there's still a need for Mexican workers in the Willamette Valley because, as I just said, things are booming in the valley. And wages were 6 times higher than what they could earn in Mexico. And so they were welcomed because of their labor. You don't have to read all this. The 1929 Box Bill did not actually become law, but it is significant because it spurred the creation of 2 laws that were highly detrimental to Mexicans, and I'll talk about those in a minute. So the Oregon legislature really supported this bill. They were calling for quotas of Mexicans and Latin Americans. So here we are in a situation where we need as many workers as we can get to fuel the agricultural industry, and then we're calling for quotas on the number of people who can be here. There was really a huge propaganda campaign to characterize Mexicans as an inferior race, as unclean, these are quotes, unclean, indolent, given to vice and crime, and easy targets. So Box was pushing his bill through, and this is what he said. And the reason I'm sharing this with you is so that you can see that there's nothing new under the sun. Box stated, and this is a quote, the Mexican peons are illiterate and ignorant. Because of their unsanitary habits and living conditions and their vices, they are especially subject to smallpox, venereal diseases, tuberculosis, and other dangerous contagions. Few, if any, other immigrants have brought us so large a proportion of criminals and paupers as the Mexican peons. 1929. It could have been said yesterday. And was.
What is the word box? What is that?
It's the name of the man who brought the bell. I can't remember his first name, but his last name was Box. What's important about the Box bill is it set the stage for this and one other bill that did pass. And this one did become law. This was the Undesirable Aliens Act. And this is the first time that they attached criminal penalties to undocumented folks in the U.S. And if you had been deported and you came back, that could carry a penalty of up to 2 years in prison and a fine of $1,000 or both. In 1929, $1,000 is a fortune. If you hadn't been deported, but you were here in the U.S., undocumented, you could face misdemeanor charges, which is still true today, a year in prison and or a fine of $1,000. But it's important to note that it's a misdemeanor to be undocumented, and it still is in the United States a misdemeanor. So it criminalized unauthorized entry and reentry, and it led to a lot of increased prosecutions and deportations, mostly, of course, of Mexican immigrants, and it led to a decline, of course, of Mexicans in the U.S. If that wasn't enough, they also passed the Mexican Repatriation Act. And let me say, repatriation is a euphemism. They were going to name it the Deportation Act, but that didn't sit well with people. So instead, they tried to convince Mexicans that they would be better off if they would go to Mexico, because people would look like them, they would speak their language, it would be a better life for them. And some people did, in fact, self-deport. This was they called it, this was during the Great Depression. And so they were wanting to increase the farm labor jobs for white people. And so they did a mass deportation of over 2 million Mexicans and Mexican American citizens. 60% of the people that were deported, of that 2 million, were American citizens. It reduced the Mexican population by 41%, which is pretty significant. On NPR, I listened to an interview by a man who wrote a book about the Mexican Repatriation Act, and he told a story about how they would just go to people's homes and say, okay, you're being deported, and they would ask if they could get their things, like, their birth certificate, and they said, no, we'll ship them to you. Well, you can imagine, they never got them. This one family had children, their birth certificates were in the house, all of their money, everything. So people lost their homes. They lost everything they had. But farmers in the Willamette Valley needed workers. Because, of course, if you deport all your workers, somebody's got to work in the fields. And so they, in turn, started trying to recruit Mexicans to come back. So on one hand, we're saying go away. On the other hand, we're saying come back. Despite these immigration efforts, by 1930, Oregon Census report over 15,000 permanent residents, not counting migrant laborers. And that's because migrant laborers move around. They follow the crops. And so they wouldn't have been counted, and they were probably undocumented and weren't counted in the census. But that's a pretty big number. Back to Lincoln County. In World War II, my dad was stationed in Nye Beach. Who knew, right? And he was a tank instructor, and they would play with their tanks in the sand dunes in South Beach in World War II, and they would swim in the natatorium, which was a big hall in Nye Beach where the parking lot is now. You've probably seen pictures of it. And there was a swimming pool, and there was also, and there was also, I think, a skating rink at some point. I don't know if it was all at the same time. I mean, it couldn't have been, but you know what I mean. So, what's my dad got to do with anything? Well, since he was here in Newport, and my grandpa and my family is in Toledo, my grandfather, who's a musician, was a musician, really, really liked to have parties. And there was nobody in Toledo that spoke Spanish, and at that point he was pretty monolingual. Spanish speaker. And so he would collect up these guys. I don't know the logistics, how he got here, how he did it, but he would take them home to Toledo and feed them rice and beans and tortillas and bathtub beer, and they would sing and have a great time all night long. And he really liked my dad and thought he was a good guy. And so he called my mom, who was picking hops in Portland, because that's what you did in the summer times to make money. And he said, you have to come and meet Frank. And I'm sure he wanted her to marry him. I mean, she was of marrying age. After all, she had graduated from high school. And he had a lot of other kids. And so they fell in love. Dad wanted to get married right away, and Mom said, I want to finish high school. I'm so close, and I want you out of the service, which wasn't far off from that point. They must have known that it was winding down by that. I wasn't around then, so I'm not sure, but I'm guessing there must have been some idea that it was winding down. I have the love letters that he wrote my mom. He wrote her almost every day, and they're so sweet. Oh, my dear. Anyway, so they waited, and then they ended up in Los Angeles, because if they had stayed in Oregon, then his family would have been really jealous. And if they went to New Mexico, her family. So they went halfway, I guess, in between, sort of. And there must have been lots of work in Los Angeles, and that's where they stayed until they retired and came back to Toledo. More government policies. I gave you a little roadmap because there's so many of them, and we're not going to talk about each of them in great detail, but just to talk about how it impacted Mexicans in the valley. At this point, other than my family, and I think there was one other Mexican family in Toledo, I'm not sure. There's no record of other Mexicans living on the coast here at that point. So we're going to talk about each one of these in a minute for a little bit, but I want to jump ahead to 1950, or actually stay in 1950 with the President Truman's Commission on Migratory Labor. There was a report that came out that blamed low wages in the Southwest and social ills on illegal immigration. Quote from the report, "The magnitude has reached entirely new levels in the past 7 years. In its newly achieved proportions, it is virtually an invasion." That was Truman. So let's look at the invasion. So first we have the Bracero program, because everybody needed workers again. And so I call it the bring them in, send them home, because the Bracero program was designed essentially to have workers just stay long enough to do the work and then leave. Well, not everybody left. But that was the idea. They recruited over 15,000 Mexican nationals overall in the Bracero program. Many settled in places that you're familiar with: Independence, Woodburn, Ontario, Cornelius, Nissa, anywhere where there was farm work throughout the Willamette Valley, south, north, everywhere you look. However, even though some of these folks have now lived in Oregon towns for 15 to 20 years, many experience segregation and a lack of acceptance. In fact, the resistance to having Mexicans in their communities was growing, and it was called nationwide the Mexican problem. Not the first time we've been called a problem. I don't know if I need to point out on the map. Huh? Yes, thank you.
I just wanted to add a further comment about the Bracero program that I learned when I saw Dolores Huerta speak. And in the very early part, it was also a shortage due to the American white men being in World War II.
Right.
And she made the comment, the braceros who came over, who saved our crops because no one would have been there to pick them,
Right.
were restrained and held prisoner on the ranches, on the farms.
Yeah.
They were actually locked up at night. They were charged more for their food and shelter than they made in wages.
Yeah.
And she made the point that actually the German prisoners of wars who were in the U.S. were treated better than the Mexican braceros who came over voluntarily to pick our crops.
Yeah. Yeah. And we're going to talk a little bit about the treatment that they received. Sure. Bob, give it. I bet. Thank you for walking that around.
In the 1950s, when the Republican Party of California moved from being a socialist party to the ultra-conservative party it is now, Senator George Murphy in the 1950s said that we needed workers in the valleys to pick the crops because white people couldn't lean over in the ground. Their bodies wouldn't do it, whereas Mexicans, their bodies could reach the ground and they could. That was his public statement. That's why we wanted them back to pick the crops.
There was no lack of racist
You're right.
statements during the 20s particularly. And thank you, up until now for both of you. See, if we all put our heads together, we get a clearer picture of what happened. So Oregon's trying to phase out Mexican labor during this time. The farm still needed help. And exactly what you said, the white soldiers did not want to do after they came home. They didn't want to do that kind of work. And so federal agencies and state agencies helped the farmers in Oregon secure Mexican-American families to come and work in the fields. The lack of workers meant that they were hired for higher paying jobs, so they got to be supervisors, tractor drivers, crew leaders, because there just was no one to work. It wasn't easy going. Some businesses welcomed their new customers. Oh, good, more people, this is good for business, right? But some stores and taverns refused to serve them because they caused trouble, spoke Spanish, or discouraged other white customers. I put in the white, other customers. And so what you see is pushback, or you bring in people to work, then you get the pushback, then you send them home, but then the farmers say, ack, and then and this is really the story of Mexicans in Oregon. Oh, sorry, I keep forgetting I have to point it there. So we have Operation Wetback, which is caused by the pushback, worrying about the browning of Oregon and elsewhere. In June of 1954, this was a federal military operation in the U.S. and in Woodburn. Before then, really, we hadn't seen troops deporting people. So they'd pick them up and they'd go through the local farms, they'd sweep, pick them all up, and also just, if you're walking down the street, they would just stop and take you away. 1.1 million Mexicans were swept up and deported during Operation Wetback. And of course, the raids disrupted the growing season. I'm sure it did here in Oregon as well. So what did the government do? Gave them more braceros, right? So this is really schizophrenic or something, isn't it? And this was also a very large deportation. In Oregon, during and after Operation Wetback, in 1957, the state of Oregon released a report that found a Spanish-speaking labor movement of 11 to 12,000 workers in Oregon from around the U.S. So at this point, our agricultural business is just booming in Oregon, right? Catholic Church helped with a lot of forms of assistance to all of these workers, including helping them organize politically. Now, this is something I didn't really know, but my friend over there, Oscar, filled me in on that. And I read this, of course. Mid-60s, 800 Mexican nationals worked in Oregon, and another study reported an estimated 50,000 annual migrant workers. But that number included Mexican Negroes and transient whites. So, in the 1960s, in December, Salem hosted the Oregon Conference of Migrant Labor to deal again with the migrant problem. But now we fight back. This is my favorite part of the program. Because before, right, we just look like, okay, we have to go here, we have to go there. In 1962, some of you will remember Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez, the Chicano movement. And I was a teenager in Southern California when this was all going on. And I didn't know anything about it until I went to the grocery store and I was handed a leaflet. And I took it home and I said, look, there's a boycott. So this was really the start of the Chicano movement in California, but nationwide. And I just had to put a picture of Dolores because she gets left off. We know all about Cesar Chavez, and if you ever get a chance, there's a beautiful video, I don't even remember the name of it, that was done about Dolores Huerta. She was a single parent of like 8 kids or something while she's doing all this work. There's also another video that I think is really fun, is that I know is on PBS, A Song for Caesar. If you ever get a chance to see that, it's so beautiful. It's about the grassroots work that they did, as well as many others, and a lot of folk singers. And what they would do is they would go to farms with a truck, a flatbed, and they would talk in Spanish. They would tell them what their rights were. They tried to get them involved in the movement. People sang songs. They sang songs in Spanish. They sang Joan Baez and all those folks sang all the songs that you know about. So Mexicans in Oregon wanted their own Chicano movement because, as you can tell, the valley and eastern Oregon is just filled with workers, and they're at this point pretty tired of being detained and treated like they're not wanted, then recruited again, and the discrimination that they experienced in their communities was great. Between 1964 and 85, Oregon experienced the rise up of a number of not-for-profit organizations created by Mexicans and Mexican Americans to fight back against the treatment that they've been getting while the agricultural industry was dependent on them. This is indicative of a picker cabin. I've seen other pictures of them taken by some people I know that I'll tell you about in a minute. Whole families lived in there, no running water, barely a way to cook. You can imagine, 5 or 6 people living in these tiny little cabins. And as you mentioned, the farmers were charged them rent. They charged them transportation costs. They also charged them for food. They would have a country store because often these places are very remote. And so there was no place to get food. And so by the time they added up all the things they were charged for, they didn't have any money left. They couldn't leave. So it truly was a form of indentured servitude. So while we're fighting back, there's an Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, and this eliminated national quotas that they said favored Northern and Western Europeans, but they set quotas for Mexicans, Central and South Americans. It did, however, allow Mexicans to petition to bring their family members to come live with them. By this point, we were seeing families. At first, it was mostly single guys who were sending all their money back home. That still is happening today. They prioritized family unification, skilled workers, and created a merit-based approach to immigration in 65. And I emphasize that because that's one of the arguments right now about immigration is we want the good people, the merit people. But back to the good news. So Oregon's Chicano movement was from 64 to 85, and in Woodburn, the Valley Migrant League, it was formed. And that really organized people in a big way in Woodburn. Woodburn was really the largest community of Mexican workers. And although Nissa and those places were, also had large numbers, but this was in the Valley. And so the Valley Migrant League, I think this is awesome. So they were like a social service agency. They had federal funds to do all these things, health clinics, influencing the Board of Education. I didn't know there was a Poor People's March on Salem in '69. I didn't live here yet. I was still in LA. They pressured Tom McCall to establish the Oregon Advisory Committee on Chicano Affairs. And of course, they received death threats and physical violence and program audits. And their federal funds dried up because Nixon cut the funding for the Office of Economic Opportunity. So all the money that they had that was doing these things was gone. They also found that in Oregon, the energy and the support for helping migrants, the energy was just kind of depleted. And we didn't have enough Mexican or Latin American politicians to fight for us in Salem. And so, and many people viewed Mexican Americans as outside the status quo and didn't want to help them. So this led to a 2-day conference at the Salem Fairgrounds to fight poverty, not just for, at this point, Chicanos, but for whites, Native Americans. They used the word gypsies in this age. Romas, a word we'd prefer to use. Russians and blacks in Oregon. So the Valley Migrant League really wanted to help get involved in the United Farm Worker Movement. But they couldn't because of their 501c3, and they were audited so much that they felt like their funds would be taken away and they would lose their nonprofit status. And so these 4 or 5 organizations were formed to be able to fight for the farm workers. But they weren't just concerned with the migrant workers. They wanted to promote cultural pride. They wanted access to higher education. They were advocating for affirmative action and non-agricultural employment. They wanted to reform the criminal justice system, and they protested the disproportionate number of Chicanos serving in Vietnam. When I read that, I thought, oh, the Vietnam War, remember that? Seems like forever ago. During the movement, some Mexicans actually got new careers from all this organizing and stuff that they were doing. And they became our first role models out of people not just working in the fields. I have to say, as an aside, I'm going to talk about higher ed in a minute, this time of the year, if you're on Facebook, I'm on a lot of Latino Facebook pages, and picture after picture of graduates in their cap and gown with their diploma in the field, hugging their parent, or I mean, it just gets me every time because they're so grateful for and they understand the price that their parents paid for them to be able to go to college. But they couldn't go to college until 1970. This was one of the things that the Valley Migrant League was able to do. They influenced Board of Ed to adopt a 3% admissions policy. In 1970, the U of O enrolled 80 young Hispanics, the first class of any size at U of O. The VML gave scholarships to Mexican Americans at OSU. Out of 15,000, there were only 23 that were Mexican. So we weren't involved. We weren't allowed to be involved in higher ed until really the 70s, when we were when they opened the door a little ways for us to become involved. With education, I love this quote. With education, the students came to understand how marginalized they were in their communities. And one writer said, quote, they became impatient social agents of radical change, and they kept the grape boycott against California grapes and lettuce going in Portland, Salem, and elsewhere. The power of education. You can see why they tried to keep us out. There was, however, the creation in the 70s of the Colegio Cesar Chavez at Mount Angel. It only operated for 10 years, mostly because of a lack of funds. But it was the first 4-year accredited Chicano-run college in the U.S. I don't believe there's ever been another one. They represented the needs and activism of the Chicano community in Oregon at a time when many Latino and Latina immigrants were fighting for rights across the nation. So Cesar Chavez actually visited the college a couple of times, trying to get publicity for the college, trying to get money for them. They owed money to HUD for housing. They owed a lot of money, and that was its demise. And they lost. So in addition to losing money, they lost their accreditation, which meant, it just tumbled. In 1985, and is still active today, Picun. Maybe you've heard about Picun. Those of you that speak Spanish, don't laugh at me. The Pineros y Campesinos Unidos de Noreste, I think is how you say that. Because of being in a household of Spanish speakers, but because I had older sisters, once they went to school, we started speaking Spanish at home, and none of us picked up any of it at all. But my parents told secrets. And when the relatives came over, it was really fun because everybody would talk Spanglish. It was really cool. But I don't know how to speak Spanish, obviously. It started, 80 field workers founded this organization to fight against exploitation and all of its effects. They're still doing excellent work, these folks. And at this point, Caribbean, Central and South Americans, Salvadorians, Guatemalans, this is when we really see, I think, a big influx of South Americans and Mesoamericans into Oregon. They were eligible for legal status because of the Immigration Reform and Control Act in 1986. And 23,000 plus Mexicans and Guatemalans were able to get permanent residency. Picun, as one of their missions, helped about 13,000 immigrants apply for residency. So, in addition to advocating for Oregon farm workers and just working Latinx families, they also work at raising the minimum wage for all workers, ensuring all kids in Oregon have access to health care. They are the largest Latino organization in the state. And they're recognizing that things are different today, and they're stepping up to those new challenges and continuing to organize on our behalf. So there was a lawsuit brought by a Mexican. I don't remember if he was documented or not, but it became a class action. And this was about 5 years before the Oregon Sanctuary Law came in effect. And you can tell things were really different. Look at it passed the Senate 29-1 and the House 58-1. Could that happen today? I don't probably think so. But that's the actual language of the Oregon Sanctuary Law. We talk a lot about the Sanctuary Law. It's the first time I've ever actually read it. No law enforcement agency of the state of Oregon or any political subdivision of the state shall use agency monies, equipment, or personnel for the purpose of detecting or apprehending persons whose only violation is of federal immigration laws. Now, just I think last week, it may have been a little bit longer than that, our Oregon Senate Oregon House had tried to pass a bill, House Bill 3551, and that would have allowed them to call in ICE and to cooperate with the feds. Luckily, it never made it out of committee. But I can tell you that there are folks in the southern part of the state that really, really, really don't want the sanctuary law to stand. So there probably will be continued attacks on it as we go along. In 1990, Mexicans were 2.5% of Oregon population. That's the ones that participated in the census. So you always have to add some to that. So in 1990, I worked for the Bureau of Labor and Industries. I was a civil rights investigator for a few years. And so I got to see up close a really fantastic action that our then Labor Commissioner, Mary Wendy Roberts, did. She got funding through the Wage and Hour Division, and she got them 2 or 3 four-wheel drives, state vehicles. She had 3 Mexicans who were English and Spanish speakers, and 1 Russian who also spoke Spanish. And off they would go for days at a time. They would take off, and I was in the same office, so when they came back, I would hear their stories. I tried my best to find documentation of this program. I wanted to be able to tell you how many farms they found. What they did is they would take off and go in the far reaches of the backwoods looking for the farms. Before this point, Oregon had no clue where the farms all were. They knew the ones like on the I-5 corridor, but we're talking back in the hills. They were in Eastern Oregon. They went everywhere. And they would take pictures and of the living conditions. They would talk to the workers. They had the right, and they sometimes had to enforce that right themselves to be able to inform the workers about their rights around wage and hour laws. They would help people apply for wage claims if, in fact, they hadn't been paid, because you were absolutely right. When you're out there in a remote place, the farmer's really in control of your life and every facet of your life. And if you have a bathroom that's unusable, there's not a lot you can do about it. And still you're paying rent. And so they would turn over these. I'm glad I don't have the pictures to show you. They were so disgusting. They would turn that over to the state health department, who would then go out to the farm and enforce the health laws. So, like I said, I have no idea how many farms they found. I wish I had a map of them to show you. I'd like to know where they are. A lot of them were Russian berry farms at the time. A lot of Old Believer Russians in Woodburn owned berry farms. and a lot of them were out there, and but they did this for at least a year, if not 2 years, looking for farms and putting them on the map. It was a huge effort, and I think a really good one. It's a sad thing that there is no record of this effort.
Why do you think the records are lost?
I don't know if they were ever created. I mean, I don't know. I have contacted different parts of Boley and trying to find records. I found a list of all the things that Mary Wendy Roberts did, and I think it just didn't matter to anybody but that venue, that group. I think it's real hidden history, and I know they found many farms, many farms.
The state library doesn't have any records?
I looked. I couldn't find any. I called Boley, and of course nobody called me back because they're short-staffed now. But couldn't find any record of any of it. So you got to take my word for it. I was there, not in the fields, but I was there. I knew these folks really well, who were going out and finding the farms. It was beautiful work. Yes. I don't know. I've lost track of them. This was about, well, like I said, this was in the 80s, the 90s. I have no idea. I do know that Maria Casares, there was one woman and 3 guys who would go out. I do know that she ended up starting Mano y Mano, which is now a fairly large social service agency for Latinos and Mesoamericans. But I would assume she's still around. I don't know. It's been a lot of years.
You might at least be able to get oral histories from.
You're right. And I did think of that. And that would be something that would be worth following up on, because this really was a monumental effort that they took on. Yes.
So, Frankie, I just Googled to see if I could, and I
if
didn't
you
doubt.
tell me you found
no,
it, I'm
I
gonna
did
be
not.
so mad.
I didn't doubt you, but let me just see. But I did find a OPB story just from March of this year, and there is legislation to create an 11-person panel of farm workers, government representatives. They said they are still one of the most underpaid segments,
Yes.
and farm workers are complaining, and largely Hispanic, Mexican, but complaining of drinking contaminated water, of unsafe working conditions,
Horrible.
poor wage. Yeah, so everything comes full circle, and here they are. Boley is investigating again.
Well, good for them, because they should. I mean, it's really in their bailiwick to do that kind of investigative work. So I'm glad to hear that. And as far as we know, we still have a civil rights division and a wage and hour division, because Oregon has its own set of civil rights laws and that aren't affected by the federal law. So
The industry is pushing back, saying they're already too overregulated.
of course. That's always the response, isn't it? We don't need no more regulation. So in the late 80s or early 90s, and again, I couldn't find a record about this, in Lincoln County, we're back in Lincoln County, the fish plants were hiring more and more workers. I don't know if any of you were here during those years. I was in the valley during that time. The Hispanic population increased in all counties in Oregon, and most of those folks who were in the U.S., in Oregon at that time were born, only 5% were born in another country. So these, for the most part, are American citizens. So the increased number of brown people in Newport didn't escape the white community. And my sister and brother-in-law owned a little store in Nye Beach in the 90s or so. They couldn't remember exactly when. They thought maybe August of 1991. They and other Latino business owners in Newport were spending the night in their storefronts, because they were having their storefronts eggs were being thrown at the windows. There were threats of the storefronts being bombed. It was really a bad time in Newport. There was a public meeting. Can you believe this was held at the PAC, the Performing Arts Center in Newport? And a lot of white folks showed up and yelled at the Mexican owners and said, you know, they're stealing our jobs. We have to do something. They're stealing all of our jobs. You would think that would have been in the Newport News-Times, but I was zooming through microfiche, and if you've ever done that, you know what a joy that is. And I only got up to about July of 91, and I didn't see a brown face from January to July, so I'm guessing that maybe there was nothing written up about it, or it was or lost. I don't know. The census data for 2010 to 2020 is about 10.4% Hispanic or Latino. In 2022, there were 224 minority-owned businesses in Lincoln County. Now, we don't know, we don't know how many of those businesses are owned by black people, Asian folk. We don't know. We just know that there were 224 minority businesses. So not a lot in Lincoln County when you think about it. In recent times, we see even more, we see a lot of Mexicans and Mesoamericans, which includes folks from Guatemala, Salvador, all the way up the coast, looking for work here. And a lot of folks pick salal for pennies, literally pennies. Tree planters, I think tree planters tend to make a little bit better money than salal pickers, but again, these folks are paying transportation to and from. There's all these other incidentals, and so especially the salal workers, I think, are not making much. But then again, when you don't speak English and maybe you are undocumented, you get the work that you can do to keep your families fed and well. And so they're still picking salal today and still tree planting and working in the fish plants and the packing plants. And as we know now, I'm not quite up to today, but as we know now, there are Mesoamericans working in all facets of this tourism industry, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that pretty quick. First, I want to talk about a few more immigration policies. The Immigration Act of 1990 actually expanded the number of immigrant visas available, and it did something very important. It created new categories for employment-based immigration. So what this means is that I'm the boss, and I need you to come here. I hold your visa. This is really, really easy to exploit, right? Because all I have to do is say, I'm not going to pay you, or you can't complain about the working conditions because I'll just pull your visa and tell ICE to come get you. And this actually happens. It happens more frequently. It happened actually just in Salem, 30 years ago, where a tortilla factory was doing that with people. That must have been in 1990. And this is a very common form of visa today, is through the employer. And employers love it because they have control. And the workers, well, they got, they got work. But it's not the best way for someone to be here. If you've ever looked, I've looked on the immigration page for the federal government, because I thought Oscar and I were going to do a show about immigration one day, and so we thought, I should look at all the different visas. There are so many different visas, and each one has a different way and a different timeline and it's impossible to figure out. And I'd like to think I can figure out bureaucracy pretty well, and I don't know how people ever figure it out, frankly. Then we have in 1996 the Illegal Immigration and Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act. Now, I'm not sure what responsibilities they're talking about there, but it really increased enforcement efforts and made it difficult to obtain legal status and expanded grounds for deportation. When we talk, the rhetoric around immigration that you hear so much of is, why don't they just come here legally? You know, why don't they do what every other immigrant has done? Well, if you can figure out this system, you deserve a PhD and above, because it's not a simple system to figure out. Following the 9/11 attacks, we see the Secure Fence Act of 2006, more increased border security, and then we've got President Obama's DACA and DAPA. DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. Right now, our country's being fueled by DACA recipients. They're doctors, they're lawyers, they're all kinds of medical professionals, they're teachers, they're the impact if DACA folks had their visas pulled, we would see the gaps left by them. DAPA isn't as well known. I had to look it up. I didn't look it up at the last when I gave this on Saturday, and I thought I better be prepared this time. Deferred Action for Parental Accountability is one thing they call it. They also call it the Deferred Action for Parents of Americans and Lawful Permanent Residents. We don't hear a lot about DAPA. DACA's the one that's in the news all the time. And this was an executive action. So it can be overturned with another executive action. And we hear in the news that there's plans to do that. Certainly hope not. Because these are folks who were brought here, a lot of them very young. This is the only country they've known. And to send them to someplace that maybe they've never been, inhuman. I stopped there because I looked at between there and presently, the second Trump presidency, we already see 279 policy actions. I'm not going to talk about them. You followed the news. You know what's going on. But if you're interested, this website, and it's on your handout, tracked the first and the second, and now the second policy actions for immigration, and you know, it's overwhelming. The good news is we have lots of good local people helping our immigrant communities here in Lincoln County. Centro de Ayuda was founded, it's the first and only one at that time, in 1993 by members of the Episcopal Church in Newport. And I was really happy when it started, because before that, one of the things they did a lot was they had certified interpreters so they could go to the hospital and the doctor's offices. Before then, they would call my dad. He'd get a call from the hospital. I don't know how they knew him, but they would get a call in the hospital and say, please come, could you interpret for this person? Well, my dad had maybe a 3rd, 4th grade education in Spanish. He didn't know the terminology, because it's really hard to know medical terminology in another language. But he felt so sorry for these folks in the hospital not being able to communicate what was wrong with them, not being able to know what the doctor said, and so he would do his best to at least try to help the person feel a little bit more comfortable in the Salem hospital. I'm not sure if that time if the hospital in Toledo was still open or not. I don't quite remember. So they do a lot of cool stuff. They make referrals. They provide medical and legal interpretation services and other forms. So if someone comes to them and says, I need to talk to my landlord about this issue, they'll help them with that. Rental agreements, legal forms. When I first knew about Centro de Ayuda during the first Trump administration, as soon as he was elected, people came in droves to their office and said, what are we going to do? What should we do? So they arranged a bilingual immigration lawyer to come down from Portland, and the room was packed with folks who were, you could tell, were just terrified because nobody knew what was going to happen. At that time, and probably again now, people were looking to have someone help them draw up legal forms for guardianship of their children in case they were snatched up, so that their children would have some place to go. It breaks my heart thinking about that, and I'm sure that that's happening today. So that was in 93. It wasn't until 2021 that Arco Iris Cultural came into being, and they had a slightly different focus. Their focus is on celebrating and supporting underserved Latinos and indigenous Mesoamericans. They tend to have a lot of Guatemalans at their organization. They're open to everyone. Centro de Ayuda tends, because they started with Mexicans, I think they tend to have more Mexicans go to them. But Arco Iris really tends to focus on Guatemalans, newly arrived folks. They provide a lot of the same things that Centro de Ayuda does. They do more arts and community building in a way. They hold cultural classes, music, dance performances, art exhibits, you name it. They, like the Siletz Indians, are very welcoming to their cultural activities. They want to be part of the community. So when they hold a fiesta for whatever event, everybody is welcome, and I would really urge you to go. They always have flamenco dancers. They always have good food, and they always have someone who can interpret if you want to ask someone a question. But they're working very, very hard to be part of our community. As is Conexión Fénix. Conexión Fénix is in Lincoln City, and it started differently than the other two. As happens so frequently in our community, if you know somebody who kind of knows how to navigate the legal system or the bureaucracy, you go to that person when you need help. And during the fires in Otis, that's what happened to Maria, who started this organization. Folks were coming to her saying, what do? We have no place to live, we have no clothes, we have nothing. And she would help them. And then when the initial crisis was over and folks were settled, the 501c3 that had been set up to help the fire victims, all of them, they gave to her to start Conexión Fénix. So that's the phoenix rising from the ashes. That's why I tell you that story, because their logo is meaningful. They really have focused a lot on education. They do something really cool in Lincoln City, and now they're doing it in Newport at the Rec Center. They call them cafecitas, where they focus on different skills that the elders know how to do. Like they did one month was piñata making, another month it was painting, embroidery, all different kinds of, and they really want the community to come and enjoy and learn, and to sit down and learn a new skill or a new craft. So I'm getting towards the end here, just so you know. These are pictures from both Conexión Fénix and Centro de Ayuda and Arco Iris Cultural. They have a big community garden. Arco Iris does behind the Newport Library. It's really big and it's beautiful. And I think there's also one of these in Lincoln City as well, at the college campus there. You can see kids, everybody's working on projects. Of course, Dia de los Muertos is a big holiday, and I'm told that in Lincoln City, a couple of years ago, they had over 500 people at the Dia de los Muertos celebration. Always have dancers. I just found out just this week that in Lincoln County, we have a dance troupe. I can't think of the name of it now. Folklorical. And so they're here too. And then there's a man who was working on that very particular kind of embroidery that I don't know how to do. And here's more dancers, an altar, some of the abuelas doing the embroidery. And so they add to the richness of our community, and they want to be community members, and they want to show that they deserve to be community members by offering these things to everybody. And the food is always, I just got to tell you, the food is awesome. So to wrap this up, I want to talk a little bit about the contributions to Lincoln County and to Oregon, in addition to all these wonderful cultural activities. We provide a talented and trained workforce in all areas of public life. We're in education, we're in medical stuff, we're in social work, roofers, landscaper. I live in an over 55 community in Newport, and every day there are Latinos there working on the roofs and working in the yards and working on, you name it, laying your rugs. And the tourist industry could not be where it is today had it not been for that influx of workers. The radio personalities. I used to be the director at KYAQ 91.7 FM. Sorry, it just kind of rolls out. And Alex does 2 or 3 radio shows, plays music, and then gives out information to the community. And because in Lincoln County there is no way to communicate, there's no other media, there's no newspapers, there's no other radio programs. It's KYAQ. We are truly the only ones able to get information out to a broader audience. And then we also have Angel, who does a show for us on so Saturday and Sundays you can hear a lot of Spanish language programming, a lot of music. I always love hearing it. It reminds me of home. So we're here, we contribute in a big way to the local economy. We spend our money here, we rent, we buy, all of that. We're college students. We have a large number of college students in OCCC. And so now we're looking at about 14% in Lincoln County, but again, we're always undercounted. So I just wrote down a couple of things that I was really hoping that you would take away today. One is that so when I set out to do this work, I didn't think it was going to be about all the immigration laws. I truly didn't. But the more I researched, the more I realized that is the story that emerged out of all the research was, they want us, they don't want us, they want us, they don't want us. And it really causes harm to families. Can you imagine? Families are split up. Families are, never sure they can stay in one place. We still suffer from discrimination in this county. It happens. You probably won't hear about it. People tend to keep it kind of to themselves. Remember, when you're an immigrant, the last thing you want to do is complain about where you are. I've been here forever, so I can complain, and I have less threat about that. I hope we busted the myth that Mexicans don't have the capacity to organize. This is, I've read this in so many books and have seen this so many times that, well, why don't they just fight back? Why aren't they fighting back? I've heard it just recently, actually. Well, are Mexicans doing anything right now to protect themselves? Well, yeah. Just because you haven't heard about it doesn't mean it's not happening. There's a lot happening under the surface because it would put everybody at risk if it was public information. But we're great organizers. We've been organizing since forever. Really, the first Chicano movement was in 1920 in Texas on the border. And as you can see, we've been fighting back ever since. And what would our community be without Mexican and immigrants? Oscar and I talk a lot about this. You know, what would happen to Lincoln County? We couldn't keep the hotels open. We couldn't keep the restaurants. Look behind any kitchen door, and I don't care what kind of restaurant it is, sushi restaurants are fueled by Latino energy. And so those are my takeaways. But we have a mic, and what are your takeaways?
Yeah. I just want to make the point, spectacular talk. I mean,
Thank
wonderful,
you. For
wonderful.
an amateur historian.
Oh, spectacular. But, yeah.
Thanks, you guys.
It's a footnote, but the history needs it. Lincoln County didn't come into existence till 1893.
Yeah.
And so all pre-1893 would have been Benton County, which has its own history, some good, some bad. And so it's interesting because I think our county is spectacular. But I know there's reasons for not saying that. But you know, it's important because this was going on before Lincoln County was here.
Absolutely. And that's why our history doesn't start until about the 80s or so.
Right.
Oh, it was really a comment about history. Can you say it?
Well, there was no Lincoln County until 1893,
Right.
when a wealthy man from Toledo paid the legislature to separate this part of the state from Benton County. And so that's...
Was it P.D.? No, not P.D. Johnson.
I don't know his name, but he was in Toledo when he was wealthy, and he paid the legislature. So, anyway, I think
Too
he
early
paid.
for it to be the Koch brothers.
I think he paid, yeah.
Who owned GP? Yeah. Do you want me to do that, Bob?
Oh, you sure?
No, please. Okay, I just...
I learned a few months ago that there is a company that, for lack of a better word, imports Guatemalan primarily workers for the food processing business, and they house them at the Shiloh Inn. And I understand Shiloh Inn's going to close. Do you have any idea where the next housing is going to be?
No, I don't. I do know that somebody was curious about all these Russian men who were hanging out in front of one of the hotels over by, I think it's the one over by, before you get to Dutch Bros. And, but, you know, Mexicans are real good at staying below the surface because of what we just saw. And so I don't know where they're staying. But good question.
This was a wonderful presentation. Thank you. But I also want to make the point, and it's not specific to Oregon, but I grew up in New Mexico, and when you're talking about immigration and immigrants and Mexicans and Hispanics, Santa Fe was established in 1610, and it was under Spanish control, and it only belonged to Mexico. New Mexico only belonged to Mexico for 25 years, and then it became a U.S. territory. And I think there's just this... I think a lot of white people sort of just associate this person's Hispanic, they're Mexican, they don't belong here, they've only been here for, a generation. And it's really, I had relatives in Ohio who kept asking me about our Mexican friend. And it was like, this woman isn't Mexican, she's New Mexican. Her family has been here for like 400 or 500 years. We are the immigrants. Their family is not the immigrants.
Yeah.
And I just think, to take a deeper thought about what actually is an immigrant and the assumptions that we have.
Well, when I put together that presentation about the history of us in New Mexico, because you're exactly right. We started out as indigenous, and some of us were then taught Spanish and became Spanish. My father always identified as Spanish, and it was almost a class thing to not be Mexican, and there was tension sometimes between him and my mom's family because they were Mexican nationals. So there's a wonderful book about that called Manifest Destinies. That's all about what happened in New Mexico in those beginning from time on out. Because my question was, how come I'm not indigenous? How did I end up being Spanish and not indigenous when I started out as indigenous? And it's a really long story. So I won't tell you that one today. But thank you for raising that. Yeah, New Mexico is really complicated when it comes to identities.
And I think immigrants, the topic of immigrants in general.
Yes, and I only talked about Mexican immigrants and some Mesoamerican, but we have other immigrants in Oregon. We have Russian immigrants. We have. I worked for an organization that also had Asian immigrants during the boat people years, after the Vietnam War, and so immigration's not a simple topic. You're absolutely right. New Mexico, it's really not simple. Thank you for that.
I just like to tell the story so people understand how complicated immigration is. I'm a white girl from Canada. I've spoke English my whole entire life. I had Apple lawyers helping me with the immigration process, and we still made mistakes and almost missed deadlines. There was a time during our visa, if my husband had lost his job, we had 3 weeks to get out of the country.
Wow.
He didn't lose his job, but when you look at someone and you think, why aren't they here legally? It is so easy to make a mistake.
That's right.
And there's no coming back from that mistake. Yeah. You're on one track, you step off that track, there's no other track to get on. You move, you forget to, we moved, we forgot to update the website. They don't know where you are. You get your summons to show up for your biometrics. You don't show up, you're done.
Yeah.
You're not allowed to be here anymore.
Tell them how much it cost you.
Oh, and I mean, Apple paid the majority of ours, but we still, just to get the medical test done was $1,000 for our family. And it just goes on and on and on. And then if the path to citizenship, you have to have money to take that next step to citizenship. And again, I'm a white girl from Canada. I saw in every office I went into the way I was treated differently from the brown or black people in line behind me, the way I was spoken to, the way I was looked at, all of that. I mean, I could go on, but immigration is complicated.
It's really complicated.
And I'm a white girl from Canada who's always spoken the language.
Yeah, it's really an impossible system made on purpose that way. And even if the Immigration Act that Biden, that bipartisan act, if that had gone through, it wasn't that great of an act. I mean, it would have been something, but it would have cost people who lived here thousands and thousands of dollars to be able to apply. It wasn't a great bill, but it was something.
I just have two. During the first Trump administration, I spent 2 weeks down at the border in a refugee processing center that was set up by the private sector, by a group of churches that were receiving immigrants who did follow the legal processes. They met somebody, an official, presented credible fear, had a hearing, were let into the country, and our government was dropping them off by the busload with ankle bracelets and no shoelaces because that was some kind of a threat. They took their shoelaces, didn't return them. So they're walking around with no money in San Diego, in San Ysidro, with no resources, with nowhere to go. And now we're taking away those credible fear rights and stripping Venezuelans of that and sending. So even when you follow the legal methods, it's so
it's a
and you're
trap
still
when people say, well, you should follow the legal way, because It's impossible.
And the story, I mean, story after story after story, and photographs of unbelievable conditions that these folks were fleeing. Secondly, when we've got folks that are here working, and we know that some of them are undocumented, they're still paying into our tax system.
Yes.
And then when something
Yes.
like, we witnessed during COVID, there is no safety net. They're contributing to, and then they're hungry and there is no paycheck and they don't qualify for assistance and they're not getting benefits. And so, yeah, that's.
And Bob and his congregation and community members, a woman named Ginger Govea, and
I looked up because we were talking about how much that group of Compañar raised, and we thought it was like $30,000 or $40,000. In 2021, they were over $100,000. So, yeah.
Because we had hungry people who were going to lose their homes, and there wasn't going to be any government money to help them. And so the community stepped up and donated money. And Ginger, if you don't know Ginger, she's an amazing gal. She would tell me that she would help support a family, not a lot of money, just a little bit of money, and every month, and then they would, after a couple of months, they would say, no, please give it to someone else. I'm okay. We're okay now. So this wasn't give me all you can give me and I'm going to take it all. It was thank you for the help, and here, help my neighbor because they need help. So, and same stories I think came out of.
We had
Bob's
COVID
action.
assistance and many undocumented folks that were and very grateful.
Yeah.
I don't want to
And there was
stereotype,
food.
but we did see some people abusing, and I don't know that it was a single brown person.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, and I've worked in social service forever. The people that abuse are such a tiny
yes.
percentage of the people that
Was
need
there
the
anybody
help.
else?
I think if there's no more questions or comments, Oscar is looking at me because it's time to give you some books.
Just real quickly, and to most of you that don't know that who I am, but I actually come from the border, and I come from El Paso and Juarez.
Yes. Sorry.
Wait, we want you on the video.
It's no problem. And I actually lived there in El Paso, which is right across at the river from Juarez. I was there the first time the administration did all of the actions. I went through September 11th. I went through the Secure Fence Act. I know how it looks. I know how I was targeted just by my skin tone. So all of the things that which Frankie has spoken about, I've been through it. We helped families. And it's just like Pastor Bob said. We helped families with child separation. We tried to go to the camp in Van Horn. We were denied. So there is a bridge in which I tell Frankie that, and for us, which we call El Paso del Norte Bridge. The Paso del Norte Bridge, and this is a one-way entrance from Juarez into El Paso. I saw how they shut down the Cesar Chavez Highway, which connects goes there underneath at the bridge. I saw how they shut it down, they fenced it up, and they were housing people there, all right? And let me tell you, in El Paso in summer, it is triple digits temperature. It can go up to 115, and then at night, it can drop down to 70 degrees. So there's a massive change. So yes, so some of the things in which Frankie, and it's just like Pastor Bob, I have experienced it. I have worked through that. I have helped families. I had friends that in high school in which I did not know that because we never asked about their DACA status. We never cared about it. That since we are a 90% Latino community, to us that it made no difference. So
So yeah, so some of these things that are real, and I've seen them.
Oscar has showed us pictures before of his workplace at Head Start. I think it was Head Start. And you look out the window like there, and there's the wall. So it's a very real, palatable thing. Also, I meant to say this the other day. The militarization of the border isn't new. In El Paso, Oscar has said that
1996, and that's when it started.
with
And it
the
was really
tanks and the,
well, not with tanks, but this is at when we saw the militarization that of Border Patrol 24/7. Okay, we saw the construction in which we see that the Rio Grande, and then that we saw another irrigation ditch that which ran parallel to the Rio Grande, and this was just to create two barriers. And then that we saw that all the fins go up, the barbed wire that are on top of it, that after September 11th, that we saw this ugly wall that of a steel fence. And last year, and when I went back home and I took pictures for Frankie, and I just had to show her, it looks horrendous. And it's just like Frankie said, when I taught, just imagine that we are just looking at the outside window, and it's just like about a quarter mile. And then that you see Juarez, and then that you see that the businesses that are in Juarez, that the roads that are in Juarez, you see that the parks that are for children that are playing, and then you see that the Rio Grande.
for those of us here on the West Coast, this isn't, it's not fathomable. And then when I see Oscar's pictures, I realize this is very real for a lot of people.
The biggest shock to me while I was there was the militarization, the walls, the barbed wire, cameras everywhere, constant surveillance, a constant drone of helicopters just overhead watching everything.
Yeah.
I stepped off a path by taking a hike to
This
the
is a
wall.
good story.
And there was nothing. It was just desolate desert. And I stepped off the wrong path, and within 2 or 3 minutes, there was a helicopter just came out of nowhere, and Humvees coming down the hill with armed guards, screaming orders at me. I'm like, where do you think I'm going? There's nothing here.
And weren't you wearing?
I was wearing my clerical garb.
I thought so. Yeah, for some protection, hopefully.
Yeah, more dangerous. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe so these
Well, a
days.
week or two earlier, I had colleagues that were arrested for praying at the border. So.
Yeah.
You would love to be in El Paso, and it's usually done in March. So what happens is that the diocese of Juarez and the diocese of El Paso, they go and there's a part, this is in Santa Teresa, New Mexico, and it's right on the fence. So what they do is that they put a stage that on our side, a stage that on the Mexican side, and then both bishops give mass together. And then you see that all the people, and when you look at the pictures, and at first, you won't imagine that there's a fence, that it's in the middle. It's just so impacting.
I have experience with that in San Isidro. They do a similar in Friendship Park, and they have gatherings in mass.
They probably can't now, though, because it'll get you arrested.
Well, they used to be able to pass communion through the wall, and then they built another one to separate it by a couple of feet, so that loved ones can't even go and touch their loved ones.
No, yeah. Well, and what's even worse is that many of you that will never experience how CBP is and how Border Patrol is.
I hope.
And when I would cross at the border, I had that one time the CBP agent. He was a real A, all right? The only thing was that to cross at the border that you could actually just use your birth certificate and with your driver's license. And so that's what we did. And then he went on this rant. He asked for my papers, and I gave them to him. He started berating me. I'm like, And once he handed me everything back, the first thing he said, let me speak to your supervisor. He even got madder at that. So they actually take me to the check station, and I spoke there with the supervisor. And I told him, look, first of all, I I don't appreciate him trying to berate me. Second of all, I'm an American citizen. Even though that we are at a port of entry, I am still an American citizen. And of him that of trying to berate me and to belittle me, he has no right. And so what I did, and it's like I told Frankie, and I wrote up that my congressman that at the time that was Beto O'Rourke. I emailed him. I filled in that the complaint on CBP. So yes, see, but all of these things, which all of you folks that will never get to encounter, yeah, those are things that us that in the border, that are brown,
Yeah.
we face every day.
Yeah. Especially living so close to the border. And tell them the story. I love that story.
And including that last year, driving home, we were, and I keep forgetting that the last gas station that is right before that you go there into Arizona. By Lordsburg. And so what happens was my 2 kids that were with me, and we were there at 1 in the morning, fueling up. When we got there, a Border Patrol agent comes and parks next to me. And I saw them, and just out of spite, I just spoke Spanish to my kids all the time, which we were there in the store. Yes. I spoke Spanish. We came to the register. He was just looking at me. We paid. We got out. And again, he was just outside, just looking at me. He was seeing that my plates and just seeing me brown, and he was just wondering what I was doing. Okay? See, so it's things like this, and which Frankie spoke about. It's part of the racism that even though that which we don't see it, it is there.
And, you know, the part that just makes us really angry, I just have to say this, is that we are so much more than just our labor. But the only time we're in the news is when it's around immigration. And that's why we started our radio show, really, was to show the variety and the breadth and depth of our culture, and that we're so much more than just, not that field work is bad work, but there's more to us than just our labor. Should we give away some books, Oscar?
And actually, that if you, for the people that are live streaming, please hold on. For you folks, that it's going to be a little bit different, but for all of you, we actually have, we are going to raffle off 4 books.
This is the educator in Oscar. I love this. He said, let's get books and give them away. I said, sure. If you come to the Native American one, Oscar's getting copies of The People Are Dancing Again, which is just the most beautiful book. So,
right.
And this book is Mexicanos in Oregon.
Yes, okay, and these are just stories that of Mexicanos that
Really
are across the state of Oregon. All right. So, and so what we're going to do for the folks that are here and so with us, that we're going to raffle off 4 books.
Okay. See, it was worth staying till the end.
And if you would please just look at the last 4 digits of your ticket.
I love this part. My favorite part. Oh, I need glasses. Hold on. I got them. Okay, I'm good to go now. 7323. All right. A book for the gal in the back.
Here you go, ma'am.
Cool. I like how you shake them up. Really. 7317. Oh, awesome. Oh, it's really lucky back there.
You're good.
Okay, 7313. All right. I love this part. And one more. Okay, 7316. I looked in your direction. Uh-oh, was it the gal that left?
Yeah, it might have been so.
We'll
Must
go
be present
again.
to, yeah.
7312. Awesome.
All right. Here we go.
Cool.
You're welcome.
Enjoy.
And then.
And then we're going to draw a couple for the folks who are on Zoom. I'm not sure how many folks zoomed in today.
Between our, and I don't know how you handle it that way, but we had 7 between our YouTube channel and the Facebook page.
Awesome. Very good. Thank you.
Yeah, and I'm sorry that since I don't have Facebook, I am anti-social media. And I actually had the names here that for the people
Oh,
that,
oh,
who,
cool.
are on,
Oh,
who
cool.
are on Zoom.
Okay, I'll hold that. I'm going to feedback though, so I better hold it over there. I'm sorry, I kept flicking this. The sound, for sound man, you know, they hate it when you do that because it goes in their ears. It goes. My husband's a sound man. I hear all about it. Just 2?
Yes.
Okay. How about Kim?
Kim? All right, and so I know Kim, so I can get a hold of Kim.
Okay, I'm not going to look because I probably know some of these people. Okay. I can't read your writing.
There was somebody who was online
Uh-huh.
With the username of LW Mills. If that's you, please contact me at oscar.juarez@oregoncoast.edu, and so that way that we can get your book out.
Yeah.
All right?
Thank you. Thank you, Pastor Bob. Thank you, sound man, whose name I can't remember. Thank you so much. Thank you, Oscar, for holding this. And thanks for hanging in there through 2 hours of lecture. And I really appreciate it a lot and hope that your knowledge was somewhat enhanced today about us. Absolutely. I'm very happy to be here and really happy that we could do this in Yachats. So.
Well, do it again.
All right. All right.
Another grant comes around.